Hi, Dean. Welcome.
Hi, everybody.
I cannot hear you. Okay, now I can hear you very well. Or you can start sharing your screen and I will disappear.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Grazie for the introduction. I'm Dean Natali, and for any soccer fans out there, for any Italian soccer fans, I'll just mention that I know my name sounds a lot like Antonio Di Natali, but that's not me. I'm not a professional athlete. Instead, I chose to follow my other childhood dream of being a shiny consultant. Now, what that means is that a few years ago, I decided I love shiny so much that I want to make that my full-time job. So now I help a lot of people and companies with all the shiny needs. So if you need any shiny help, feel free to contact me. Now, I assume that by now, a lot of you know what shiny is, but just to make sure I'm not leaving anyone behind, shiny is an R package that allows you to create interactive web pages in R. It has a lot of different use cases, and it's used by really every type of industry. But let me just show you one type of a very common use case for Shiny. What we have here is a Shiny app that lets you visualize data about cancer incidences in the US. So on the right side, we have our data. You can imagine this is just a data frame in R. And what Shiny allows us to do is build a web page, this web page that has some input controls where I can select, for example, the types of cancer I want to look at and the years. And on the right, again, I'll see my filtered data sets. I can also choose to download the data, or I can look at some plots. So this is a basic Shiny app, but the key is to understand that all the data transformations, all the plots, everything happens in R. And using Shiny, we can put a user interface in front of it so that it can be accessed as a web page instead of using our command line. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is a very different type of Shiny app. It's actually more of a service than an interactive web page. It's called CRANalerts. And what it is it's this page where you can enter the name of an R package in your email. And then anytime that this package gets updated on CRAN, you'll get notified. You'll get an email that looks like this. So that's what CRANalerts is. And this is not a typical Shiny app at all. In fact, I would say that Shiny isn't even the best tool for making something like this, perhaps. I only did it in Shiny because it was just like a little side project for fun, and I wanted to see if I could do it in Shiny. Now, even though this isn't a common use case for Shiny, I still think that there's a lot of very valuable lessons that I could highlight using this project. And these lessons are not applicable only to Shiny. So even if you don't do Shiny yourself, these are just lessons that are useful for any kind of code you write. So the first thing I want to discuss is the idea of automation. I believe in trying to automate your tasks as much as you can. If you notice that you or your colleagues are doing the same thing over and over, then maybe try to look if you could automate it. Now, this, of course, isn't always the case. Like if you have something that takes 20 seconds and you do it once a week and nobody else is doing it, then maybe don't worry about that. But I think it should at least be considered. And that's actually why CRANalerts became a thing. So what happened with CRANalerts is that about 2.5 years ago, Jim Hester made some changes to the read R package. And he noticed that his update was going to break one of my packages. So it was very nice of him. He actually opened the pull request on my package that would fix the problem that I was going to have once this package gets on CRAN. So I asked him, if I scroll down, you'll see that I asked him, when does he expect his new read R package to go on CRAN? And his response was that it should happen this very same day. So for the next few weeks, I kept checking CRAN every few days to see if it was updated yet. And it wasn't. Now, during the same time, I was also getting people asking me about when some of my packages are going to get on CRAN, because sometimes I add new features to a package and it's on GitHub, but some people only want to install packages from CRAN, not from GitHub. So they kept asking me when it's going to CRAN. And I never had a good answer. I used to tell them to just check CRAN every so often, and then one day it'll be there. And that's not a good answer. So what I did is I went on Twitter and I asked if anyone knows of a good way to get notified when a CRAN package is updated. And there wasn't. So that's when I decided that I should do something about that. Since this is something I do often and other people seem to do, I built a tool for this. And that's what CRANalerts is. So even though checking CRAN only takes a few seconds, by building this tool, I was able to not only free up my future time and also other people's future time, but it also kind of frees up my mind because that's just one less thing to think about. Now I don't have to worry about constantly reminding myself to check CRAN for some package. I'll just get notified when that happens. And by the way, if someone's interested, it actually took, you can see that his question, my question to him was in January 2018. It actually took 10 months until November to actually get read R and CRAN. So it's a good thing I didn't keep checking every day. Now, the next thing I want to say is don't keep secrets. What I mean by that is that we have a tendency to be afraid of putting our code out there in the public. And I think it stems from a couple of things. I know that in many cases, people don't want to make their code public because they're afraid of being judged. Or a lot of times people think that maybe someone will steal their code and use it to their own benefit. Now, I see this a lot. And I used to have this mindset too. But I can tell you that putting my work in the public has helped me a lot. It gives me more visibility. It means that people can fix my bugs or add features to my work. It also kind of forces you to work in ways that are not too sloppy since people can see it. And I even know that some people get job offers because they made some open source project that somebody's noticed. Now, obviously, there are some cases where you shouldn't. Like if you work in a company and your project is proprietary, then keep it private. But I would argue that for any side project you work on, the default mindset should be that whenever you start working, just make it public from the beginning, rather than doing it the other way around, which is making it private and then later on trying to think whether you should publicize it or not. And of course, I'm talking about this in CRANalerts because CRANalerts is itself public too. So there's a link at the bottom to the code if anyone wants to go and look how it's done. Now, the next point I want to make is that sometimes there really are some things you want to keep secret or private. And this goes hand in hand, actually, with what I just said about how you should try to open source your code. Because part of making your code open is making sure you don't have any sensitive information in it. So if you use anything like API keys or tokens or credentials, you have to make sure not to put those directly in your code. Now, I hope it's easy to understand why you don't want to have your database password, for example, in your code if it's public on GitHub, because you're essentially sharing your password with the world. But even in private projects, it's still important to follow these guidelines because they could at some point become public, or maybe it'll be shared with one person who shouldn't have access to your password. I can tell you that in my experience, about a third of my new clients, when they send me their code initially, it has some password or similar information in it. So it's clear that there are a lot of people doing this, and it's a dangerous practice. To show you a more concrete example, CRANalerts actually has some code in it that connects to an email server so that I can send emails. But the entire code is on GitHub and it's fine, it's safe. I don't have to worry about anyone stealing my password because as you can see here, this is where the password is being used. The password's not given directly in the file. It's being read from a special file that's not on Git. Now, I don't have time to go into the different ways of storing secrets like this, but I hope that anyone who's listening now will at least keep this in mind next time you have to store some sensitive information in your code. Now, I'm going to skip the next point just because of time. And the next thing I'll mention briefly is the idea of talk-driven development, which I find to be very effective. What that means is that when you agree to give a talk about a topic, if you have any small to-do items that you haven't done in a very long time, sometimes just the pressure of giving a talk is the perfect motivation to getting things done. As an example, anyone who has experience with Shiny is probably familiar with this gray box here that says disconnected from server. If you're on a small screen, you might not be able to see it too well, but it's just a small gray box that always shows up when a Shiny app disconnects. And you don't have any control over it. But I really didn't like how it looked. So I did find a way to change that message in CRANalerts. I'm hearing some echo. Okay. So now in CRANalerts, whenever you get a disconnection message, it actually looks like this. Now, I've seen other people over the years ask how they can modify that gray message. So I've been wanting for a long time to make this into a package so that other people can use it too. But I just never found the time for it. And then last week, because I knew people were going to look at my code, I wanted to clean it up a bit. So I finally took the time to create a package, called it Shiny Disconnect, that gives you a lot more control over that message. And now I use it in all my apps. So again, the only reason I built this Shiny Disconnect package is because of this talk. So if you have some side project that you've neglected for a while and you really want to finish, then maybe agreeing to give a presentation about it will give you that last motivating push. The next thing I want to talk about is something that I think gets brushed over too much, but I believe it's very important. Whenever you make anything, whether it's a package, a Shiny app, any piece of software, I think the functionality is very important, but that's only half of the story. I would argue that UI UX is just as important. UI UX stands for user interface and user experience. And to show you why I say that, let me show you what CRANalerts looked like after just one day of working on it. This is the first version of CRANalerts. It's fully functional. It took me less than a day to make it, but I think you'll agree that if I released it, nobody would use it, even though it's just as useful as the current version. I literally spent just as much time, about one more full day, on getting it to look the way it does now. And I hope you'll agree it was worth it. So that's why I think it's important to invest, maybe not as much time as I do, but at least some time on UI. The other part of this equation is UX, user experience. UX is about making your tool intuitive and user-friendly. I'll show you some examples of what UX does in CRANalerts. So in CRANalerts, when you load the page, you'll notice that the cursor immediately starts inside the R package input. You can start typing right away. So that's an example of UX. I mean, I explicitly thought that would make it a bit easier for the user. Or for example, if I press enter, that's the same thing as clicking on the green button. Or if I forget how to spell a package and I type Shiny with a capital S, then it'll actually tell me maybe I meant Shiny with a small s. So none of these things have a huge effect on their own, but when you just take a little bit of time to think about a bunch of these items, it makes your app a bit easier to use overall. And hopefully seeing these examples will make you think about this sort of thing when you build Shiny apps. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of defensive programming. It's a concept similar to defensive driving. You should try to be safe and protect yourself from other people's mistakes. You should write code in a way that doesn't only work when everything goes right, but it should assume that sometimes unexpected behavior from users or from other packages will happen, and you need to try to protect your code from failing when that happens. I can show you an example of what happens when you don't practice defensive programming. In CRANalerts, the way that I know which packages are updated is by calling the base function available.packages. And since that's a base function, I just assumed that it would always work. And it did always work for about 1.5 years, until one day last summer when the entire R project website, including CRAN, was down. What happened in CRANalerts is that the call to available packages returned nothing, returned no packages because CRAN was down. But I didn't account for that case. So my code thought that this means all the packages were removed. And so it emailed that to everybody. And this was obviously a pretty big problem. A lot of people got kind of angry, actually. So I've fixed that code now. So it tries to look at multiple mirrors, not only the default CRAN one. And if no packages are found, then the code stops. That's what defensive programming is. And I'm actually kind of disappointed in myself that I didn't do that as the default. So that's all the time I have to talk about today. If you have any feedback, positive or negative, I'd love to hear it. I'm always open to hearing any suggestions or comments. Don't worry about offending me if you disagree with anything I said. And I just want to say a big grazie to the Shiny team and everybody in the R community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. You are perfectly on the schedule.
Thank you.
I remind the audience that the Q&A will take place in a separate session at the end of all presentations. So stay with us and go to the Q&A session at 3 p.m. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.